This video is the final in my series. If you have not seen the other videos, then I recommend that you watch those, as this video will be building on the foundations that I've built on the previous two videos. The intent of the series is to invite discussion about the culture surrounding video games, and anthropology is a discipline about studying people, particularly with a focus on cultural practices and behavior, and anthropology is just one of many avenues to be able to understand human behavior. I want people who watch this series to be able to think about what I've said and how they engage with video games as a medium. I want to hear from you in the comments below about the concepts that I have talked about in this series. First, before we get started, I want to establish that video games are art. Games are able to present complex ideas to the player and can argue against ideologies or concepts the same way a movie can, by presenting them as evil. And like any form of art, video games are a reflection of the world that made them. Just like television and movies, a snapshot of common attitudes and cultural expectations are often captured in video games. The 2005 adaptation of War of the Worlds is a reflection of the cultural climate in the wake of the events of 9/11. Older shooters that came out in the 90s or early 2000s, like Duke Nukem or Blasto, contain humor that some would find crude or distasteful nowadays, with protagonists and mechanics that objectify women and treat them as rewards for important events. There's a theory penned by Jesper Juul that expands on this concept, the theory of the half-real. The theory is as follows: the games follow their own rules within the confines of the screen, but developers take advantage of certain shorthand when designing characters or other aspects of their games in order to get a message across to players. A player understands that a character like Chun-Li, who fights using kung fu and dresses in Chinese-inspired attire, is ethnically Chinese. So if the game exists within our world, does that mean that Chun-Li is a Chinese woman? I'm not positing that Chun-Li actually exists. Rather, I'm asking that if China exists in Street Fighter and also in our world, does that make Chun-Li a Chinese woman? I would argue yes, because she's clearly made with the imagery and the connection in mind. This is also known as coding, or when a character in a fictional medium, even if they are not explicitly human, is anthropomorphized with features that suggest a certain culture or ethnicity. There are many examples of coding, from villains in media co-opting LGBT culture and imagery, to George Lucas making Jar Jar Binks a caricature of Jamaican culture, to J.R.R. Tolkien's orcs being described as Mongol-like. Coding, while often intentional and with explicit intent, is not always negative, though. Rather, it's a measure of harm versus good that can be ascribed to the sorts of stereotypes the coding of a character might be promoting or subverting. Now, why does any of this matter in terms of politics and what they have to do with video games? Well, before we can talk about that, I want to introduce another theory, and this is the theory of deep play. Deep play was first invented by Jeremy Bentham and further developed by Clifford Geertz. Deep play is a game with stakes so high that participation is difficult to justify. At the time Geertz was conducting his research, cockfighting in Indonesia was illegal. Though money was involved, what mattered most to the men in the cockfights was the social status to be gained or lost from a battle. There was also an immense sense of pride and status associated with these fights. While playing video games does not have nearly the same monetary, social, or legal risk that fighting cocks does, there is another cultural phenomenon Geertz notes that can be more easily attributed to video games. The owners of fighting cocks would often anthropomorphize and even attribute themselves to their roosters, treating the birds as an extension of themselves. In the context of video games, the controllable avatar is the fighting cock, and the player is its owner. Video games offer a unique form of protagonist that other media cannot offer in nearly the same capacity, which is the silent protagonist. Protagonists in media are typically developed as relatable characters so that the audience can connect with their struggles and be invested in their stories. But in video games, many companies cast aside complex characterization in favor of the silent protagonist. A voiceless character with little to no outward personality, the silent protagonist becomes a vehicle for the player to interact with the world of the game. In a way, the player becomes the protagonist. Early video games often leaned on this silent protagonist as they did not have the technology to support complex animations and dialogue. Even today, games employ use of this character trope as well as a robust character creation system, which allows for players to create any kind of person that they may like, even themselves. Without the buffer of a character with a lot of personality, distance from the events of a game is even further reduced. Oftentimes, players refer to actions taken in-game as, I did such and such, or I died.
I'm alive! Wait, I'm alive! I'm alive! I'm alive! I'm alive! I'm alive! No!
Instead of referring to a silent protagonist by name, obviously the player avatar won't do anything that the player doesn't tell it to, so it's easy to see why players would link actions made by their avatars to themselves. The silent protagonist is practically engineered to be projected onto, like the fighter and his prize fighting bird. As such, the already highly personal experience of playing a video game becomes even closer to the player. But we also see other aspects of deep play emerge. For the average player, deep play carries no monetary, social, or legal risk. The exceptions are the best players, who enter competitions of skill in their game of choice for fame and fortune. Competitive players of fighting games, for example, take great pride in their character choices in alternate colors, often choosing the same one each time. Players are often identified as much by their character than they are by their usernames. Commentators will refer to avatars and the actions of it as though the player has performed them.
Catch, him off guard, but that Ahan gonna hit him instead. Now knocked off the stage once more. How are we getting to ledge here? Leo just so terrifying, and he keeps rolling at ledge. Of course, Leo has the read on that.
So scary. Excellent move by Leo, and again, he's able to get that stock off of Tweak, who just is looking like he's running out of steam.
Advertisements showing famous competitors will often show the character that they play most often alongside the player themselves. Sometimes the player is not shown at all in favor of just the character they play and their username. Tournaments may not always have a monetary payout, but players come regardless to potentially be the winner and earn social status. These tournaments are streamed live, and so competitors and their play are displayed to a wide audience. This can lead to both renown and humiliation. Players can potentially be publicly embarrassed for their poor performance in a test of skill in front of thousands of people. And now, finally, we can get into politics. What exactly are politics? You see a lot of gamers getting mad at them being included in games, so what are they? A lot of the controversy can be directly linked back to the Gamergate movement, a reactionary campaign against the increased inclusion of more feminist influences in game development. Gamergate was less of a movement and more of a concentrated backlash against a perceived slight. It was a very volatile subculture of gamers who felt that introducing feminist ideas, even so small as toning down the sexualization of a woman in a video game, was an attack on their culture. Gamergate isn't really around anymore in name, though there are still a large amount of people that prescribe to the rhetoric and still engage in similar practices in less concentrated bursts. Many who disagree with them have taken to simply calling them gamers. While confusing, some more progressive players have a definite negative connotation with the word gamer and will refuse to prescribe it to themselves, while using it negatively to refer to players that are more right-wing. These right-wing gamers are the kinds of people that would often kick up controversy about quote-unquote including politics in games. It could be argued that art is inherently political and that the choice to not include any sort of social commentary at all is a political act in itself. But video games often do include politics. There are countless games about war, either fictional or historical, and war isn't an explicitly political act. In fact, the critical masterpiece Bioshock is dedicated to arguing against Ayn Rand and objectivism. But war and ideological conflict is often not what politics means when gamers use the word to talk about video games. What they mean is the inclusion of LGBT identities, of pronoun options, of provocative women's clothing being made more practical and less objectifying. Linguistically speaking, calling the implementation of these more inclusive options politics is a way to frame their presence as negative. By saying that a video game contains politics sounds very strange. It's a sudden clash between reality and fantasy, and an overt implication through that context that they do not belong together. Detractors intend to argue that politics have no place in video games by implying they soil the inherent escapism of the games themselves. Games are meant to be an escape, a means to get away from the pressures of reality. But for some players, escapism comes in the form of being able to live in a world that accepts the player for who they are. So I would like to present my own theory. To the conservative gamer, it is not the idea that reality and video games cannot mix. Players can easily accept half-real details of characters, such as Mario being a plumber. Rather, it is the fact that video games create an idealized world for each player. In these games, any player can achieve greatness. You can become the hyper-competent hero that saves the world. You can marry the person of your dreams. You can explore vast, uncharted worlds. But for those vocal players that voice their dislike over political inclusions, what they are experiencing is a kind of cultural dissonance. That is, the inclusion of LGBT-friendly options interferes with the idealized reality that the game constructs for these gamers, who in turn causes them to feel uncomfortable and confused. Zahara Montazer, which I don't think I pronounced correctly, outlines how cultural dissonance is addressed by those affected. First, the source of discomfort is noticed and identified, and they begin to search for a solution. Usually they will engage with other people in the same situation to find a way to solve their discomfort. Within these groups, they come to a consensus on what to do next, as they want to remain in control of their own identity. As other people in the group validate their views, each person within it feels empowered, and feelings of isolation and anxiety are overcome. Now, if we apply this model to the cultural dissonance experienced by gamers, you see that in their reality where the player can be anything they want to be, the conservative gamer is suddenly confronted with characters that aren't a part of their fantasy. The gamer will have preconceived notions of what can and cannot exist within their ideal fantasy, often shaped by a straight or white-centered view. There are half-real concepts within the game that they can accept as truth, and these players are confronted with a character that challenges those beliefs, so they feel as though they are being forced to accept a truth that they may not be ready to confront. If they accept that the character Parvati is an engineer, must they also accept that she is asexual and a lesbian? Must they accept that people like her may exist in the same reality that they occupy, inside and outside of the game? As the gamer struggles with these questions, the dissonance often leads to them lashing out at the game online. These posts are found by other similar thinking people who have also experienced the same dissonance and maybe posted about it themselves. The posts are shared and people gather to comment on them, creating a sense of validation and assuring the player that their discomfort is justified, as many others feel the same way that they do. In this way, the gamer never really asks himself why he was upset. He just knows that he was, and that validation tells him that it was okay to be angry. As developers realize that there is a large market of LGBT youth that enjoys video games, some developers choose to implement those LGBT-friendly options and characters to appeal to that audience. And I mention this for two reasons. First, while there are undoubtedly developers that want to represent their identity in the games that they're working on, I feel it is ultimately the choice of the company to add LGBT characters, and that the choice is often motivated by money rather than advocacy. The second is that conservative gamers seem to believe that games that include more diverse casts, particularly when it comes to transgender or non-binary characters, have been included because of the influence of leftists. In my experience, said leftists only really get up in arms about games that include truly offensive and backwards thinking content. I've never seen any LGBT player complain that there were no pronoun options in a game, or at least it lacks the usual vitriol that a gamer will hurl at a game that is something a little too progressive for their tastes. Perhaps this is because LGBT players are used to their identities not being respected and have already found ways to cope with it. They are used to the world not considering them and often react with pleasant surprise when a game throws them a bone in a form of representation. Meanwhile, the stereotypical white, straight, male gamer will have had little difficulties in his life that he's had to confront. Compounded by cultural dissonance, he also experiences what is known as white fragility, or the phenomenon of privileged groups reacting with anger or guilt when confronted with a seemingly innocuous challenge to their authority. Robin DiAngelo writes about white fragility in her book of the same name, outlining this experience in greater detail. Overall, it's very similar to cultural dissonance, but with the added sense of privilege. Though their lives are not perfect, they have been enhanced by whiteness, and media tends to mirror this sentiment. It has been pointed out again and again that many game protagonists are the same white man with a 5 o'clock shadow. It's almost like a status quo, and deviations from that are seen as a challenge to this subtle expected norm. If anyone watching this has ever felt this way, that something was being taken from them and given to someone else by the inclusion of LGBT-friendly options. My point isn't to convince you that those feelings are wrong. In fact, I want you to think about how you felt more. Think about what I've said about why you might have felt angry or confused. One of the great strengths of anthropology is its ability to make the strange seem familiar, and the familiar seem strange. To put an experience you couldn't name into words. I don't expect anyone to really change their mind, but I would consider it a victory if I made you think a little about what I've said, and maybe even applied it to yourself. And with that, that's the end of my series. I encourage you to leave your thoughts in the comments. I will try to answer any questions that anyone happens to have, or even have a little discussion with anyone who happens to be curious. I encourage you to leave your thoughts in the comments below, as I made this series with the intent of sparking discussion, and I'll also be happy to elaborate on any subjects that I brought up but did not elaborate on with great detail due to, well, time and the intent of making this as easy to understand as possible. I would like to give a special thanks to my girlfriend, Kara, for editing the audio of my voice. I didn't really want to have to listen to myself. It really saved a lot of time in putting these videos together that she was willing to step up and edit the audio for these videos together. It really means a lot. She also recorded a little bit of extra gameplay for me, which was really good when I was actually too busy to play games to get the footage myself. The same goes to my friend Buddy, who also got some footage for me of the Outer Worlds and Fallout. It really means a lot to me that you two were able to help me out in this way. To everybody else, have a great day, and stay healthy.